Welcome to Lecture 7 for the historical books, BRITE Old Testament 5:10. Today we'll be making our transition from 2 Samuel into the book of 1 Kings as we move on from David into the reign of Solomon, Rehoboam, and the divided kingdom. I've included some of the information from the end of the last lecture at the beginning of this lecture just to remind us how the book of 2 Samuel ends. But really our focus is going to be on how the book of 1 Kings starts. So let's get started. I mentioned in our last lecture that 2 Samuel chapter 24 is a very unusual way to end the story of David. We tie up the story of David by putting a nice neat bow on it, that bow being a catastrophic failure, as David has a catastrophic sin that costs the lives of 70,000 men from Dan to Beersheba. It's convenient, at least in terms of the story goes, because David will go and purchase the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, which according to the tradition that the chronicler will lay out is actually the site where Abraham was going to offer Isaac on the mountains of Moriah, and this is also the spot where Solomon would build the temple. So it is a nice, neat transition from 2 Samuel to 1 Kings. Although keep in mind that really the story from 1 Samuel through 2 Kings is really part of one story and was probably originally one book. However, there are some clues that if we were to divide it, we would divide it where we have divided it. Because 2 Samuel ends with this nice song and poem by David, just as 1 Samuel opened with a nice poem by Hannah. So we have this nice bookend that tells us this is deliberate. We also have a nice chiasm here, that term coming from A and then B as the first two thoughts, and then B and then A, so a reverse. If we were to lay these out on a piece of paper, we would have A, and then under A we would put B, and then in the next column we would have B at the top and A at the bottom. So AB, BA. When you then connect the B's with a line and connect the A's with a line, you end up with an X, which looks like the Greek letter chi, hence the term chiasm or chiasm, basically a repetition in reverse order. In 2 Samuel 21, we have a problem. There is an outbreak or some evidence of God's anger against Israel that we have to find out what has been done and how can we fix it. David finds out it's by Saul's sin, and he fixes it by allowing the 7 sons of Saul to be executed. Although several scholars have pointed out that the plague doesn't really end until David collects all the bones of the 7 sons and the bones of Saul and Jonathan, and reburies them in the tomb of Kish, Saul's father. Only then does the plague actually stop. We also have an indication that the Rizpah, the concubine of Saul, has been watching over the bones this entire time. We get the impression that the execution took place in spring, and that she has watched them through the entire summer, and that then they are reburied in fall. So it's been a substantial amount of time that has taken place here, and then once David goes and properly disposes and gives a proper burial to all of those bones, then God sees fit to allow the plague to stop. We have the same plague take place in 2 Samuel 24. Again, God is angry. We don't know why, but he incites David, who then goes and numbers the people, which then causes a plague, which then once again has to be atoned for. This time it is atoned by sacrifices on what will become the Temple Mount. So our bookends here are 2 Samuel 21 and 2 Samuel 24. In the middle we have mighty men, as we see at 2 Samuel 21, the occurrence of several mighty men and their mighty deeds, followed by the words of David. We then transition to 2 Samuel 23 and the last words of David, and again an account of mighty men, so going in the reverse order of the previous chapters, and then again wrapped up by that plague that takes place in 2 Samuel 24. So it's clear that 2 Samuel 21 through 2 Samuel 24 really do form a unit of several chapters here at the end of 2 Samuel. These are not just random ideas that are put on, and these are not just a random conclusion to a book, but a well thought out bookend to the book. We then transition into the first several chapters of 1 Kings with David handing over the kingship to Solomon and rejoicing in the fact that he actually gets to see Solomon become king while he's still alive. So as we've ended 2 Samuel, we haven't ended with David dead. We actually wait till 1 Kings chapter 2 for that to take place. So in many ways, the first 2 chapters of the book of Kings could almost be considered the last 2 chapters of 2 Samuel, except that they're not, because we have divided the books where we've divided them, based on that bookend and based on the chiasm that takes place in 21 through 24. Keeping in mind that our chapter divisions and even our book divisions based on scrolls are not inspired, although they become tradition, and there is a reason that we have done it, but we do need to understand that the story of David really continues in those first couple chapters of Kings as a transition into Solomon. We don't end the story of David in 2 Samuel 24, and in some ways we don't really end the book because it continues into 1 Kings, but we do end the book, at least for our purposes in our English Bibles, tying it up with a nice, neat bow, but that bow is really a transition to the next book, as eventually this is where the temple will be built by Solomon, who we're about to meet. The first chapter of 1 Kings is an unusual chapter. First, we have King David, who is old and can't get warm, and so he has to have a concubine who snuggles with him in order to keep him warm. The text is very careful to say that David does not actually know her, does not have sexual relations with her, although in some ways this is probably another indication of how old he is, the fact that he may not be able to have sexual relations with her if he wanted to. Again, showing David's weakness here. The chapter is also unusual because Adonijah goes and sets himself up as king, which is odd because, awkwardly, David is not dead yet. Adonijah is presumptively having himself crowned as king and preemptively having himself crowned as king. His reaction when he hears that Solomon has been crowned king suggests that Adonijah knew that Solomon was supposed to be king. And the fact that Adonijah goes and asks Solomon for mercy while Adonijah is clinging to the horns of the altar also suggests that Adonijah knew that he was not supposed to be the next king and that Solomon would be the next king. This is important to realize because Nathan and Bathsheba go to David while he's laying in bed trying to stay warm, a very pathetic scene, and point out the fact that Adonijah has made himself king, and yet ask David, didn't you say Solomon was supposed to be king? We have no indication of a story previously in either 1st or 2nd Samuel of David telling us that Solomon was going to be king. We do, however, have an indication in 2 Samuel that Solomon is called Jedediah by the Lord himself, Jedediah meaning beloved of the Lord. So it would appear that the Lord himself has selected Solomon as the next king, and that this is not just political intrigue on the part of Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, nor is it simply the will of David. This is the will of God. Once Adonijah hears what has happened, he and all of his co-conspirators flee. Joab is one of those co-conspirators, and in 1 Kings chapter 2, Solomon will actually execute Joab, according to the words of David. David warns Solomon not to let Joab's head go down to the grave in peace, and Solomon takes care of this by having him executed even while he's holding on to the horns of the altar. It's interesting that David himself does not take care of this, and we're not really told why. It's possible that David and Joab were close enough in blood relations because of the fact that it is David's sister's sons that are the sons of Zeruiah. That's one possibility. Others have suggested that it's simply a tradition that you don't execute family members. Again, the oddity of this is that Solomon is instructed to execute them. A third possibility is that David needs Joab. Joab is the leader of his armies, and David is afraid that if he really tries to replace Joab, Joab will rebel against him, especially because every time that David replaces Joab, Joab simply kills the replacement. Maybe David is afraid of Joab the way that Ishbosheth was afraid of Abner. The text never explicitly states it, but it does imply that that is indeed the case. Solomon's justice also has to do with the execution of Shimei, the man who insulted David. We are told that Solomon is wise and that Solomon tells Shimei that he's not allowed to leave Jerusalem. He tells him that he's not allowed to leave Jerusalem crossing a particular river. However, when Shimei does leave Jerusalem, he doesn't cross that river. But he does leave Jerusalem, and Solomon sees this as an opportunity to execute him, which he does. Solomon also removes Abiathar as priest, which fulfills the promise all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 3, where God told Eli that his sons would no longer be priests. Once Eli is removed, the house of Abiathar is no longer priests, and instead the house of Zadok begins as priests, although it appears that the two of them had functioned for a while as co-priests. Now it is just Zadok who will be priest. 1 Kings 2 is really focused on justice being meted out by Solomon as he follows the instructions of David. But in 1 Kings 3, we realize that Solomon has wisdom of his own and that he's able to think on his own because Solomon asked for wisdom from God. He goes to the high place at Gibeon. The Ark of the Covenant is in Jerusalem, of course, but the rest of the tabernacle seems to be in Gibeon. Solomon goes there, has a vision where God asks him what he wants, and he says he would like wisdom. And by 1 Kings chapter 4, we begin to see that wisdom demonstrated, and Solomon's kingdom is established as he begins to wisely answer the problems of the people, wisely lead his kingdom. He has solidified his kingdom. Eventually, he will even execute Adonijah for Adonijah wanting to take Abishag, the concubine of David that was keeping David warm. Again, we remember back to the idea of concubines with Ishbosheth and Abner, and even with Absalom and David, the fact that taking a king's concubines meant that you were taking the kingship. And Solomon points this out to Adonijah before Adonijah is executed. So in the end, 1 Kings 1 through 4 really establish Solomon's reign. They transition from David to Solomon. David dies. Solomon asks for wisdom. Solomon executes anybody who is a political rival under David and establishes his reign and prepares to build the temple. 1 Kings 5 through 9 tell the story of the building of the Temple of Solomon, a process that takes 7 years, which is very common for stories of the building of temples in the ancient Near East. We have a similar account in the Gudea cylinders, which also takes 7 years. We also have 7 being the number of days that it takes to build a world, both in the creation story that we read in Genesis 1 and 2, and in the epic of the Enuma Elish, where it takes 7 tablets to build the world. 7 is very important here. There's also another link in 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 40, where we read that Hiram rested from the works that he had done, which sounds very similar to God resting from his works of creation. Creation and the temple are directly linked. We talk about this more in the Pentateuch in the book of Exodus as the holiness of the temple is emphasized, and as the temple is really emphasized as the center, in fact, as some people say, as the navel of the world. This is the spot where God is accessed. This is the place where God dwells. This whole building process reaches its climax in the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, finishing on the first day of the festival, the 15th day of the 7th month. This is significant because it's the same time that Haggai will stand up and give his famous prophecy about the greater glory of the temple that is yet to come. We know that that greater glory is fulfilled in the New Testament, but here in the Old Testament we see a great glory as the glory of God fills the temple to the point that the priests cannot go about their work. This effectively ends the Exodus because it means that the tabernacle is no longer needed. Now the tabernacle, which has been at Gibeon, has been replaced by the Ark of the Covenant in the temple in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is now the home of God, as God demonstrates that by filling this with the cloud, that cloud that had led Israel for so long. Now all Israel knows God lives in Jerusalem. This is God's home. In fact, the entire world knows this is God's house. This is where God dwells. This is where God is accessed. This is now where the Day of Atonement will take place. This is where all the festivals will take place. This is where Israel will come 3 times a year for the Passover, for the Feast of Pentecost, and the Feast of Booths. They will come to Jerusalem to celebrate. This is now the center of Israel's world. In fact, as Israel understood the world, this is the center of the world. Again, that idea almost of the temple being the navel or the belly button of the entire world. There are a couple lingering questions, though, from 1 Kings 5 through 9. One is who's actually building the temple. We know that Hiram, the king of Tyre, is the one who provided the materials. We also know that Hiram, a half-Israelite, is the skilled man who will build a lot of the temple, and yet the text ambiguously refers to he. He built this, and he did this, and he did that, almost as though the text is giving Solomon credit for all of it, which in many cases seems to be the intent of the author of First Kings, that he is indeed making it seem like Solomon builds all of it. We also don't have an indication of who the high priest is, even though we know that Zadok and perhaps Abiathar, depending on the timing of Abiathar's removal, but Zadok is the high priest, and yet he's not mentioned at all. Instead, all of the emphasis again is on Solomon. We continue to see an emphasis upon the king acting in a priestly role, and that's what we see in this passage here. Solomon is doing all of this through other agents, but Solomon is the one that is being highlighted. Solomon is the one that is being emphasized. Solomon is the one who is acting very much like a priest. And so we see Solomon as king taking control of the construction of the temple, even the appointment of Levites, much like his father David. And we see this not just in David and Solomon, but we will see this in all of the godly kings of Judah, that they are the ones who repair the temple, they're the ones who take care of the temple, they're the ones who establish worshipers, they're the ones who appoint the Levites to particular tasks. So even though the high priest has an important role, especially on the Day of Atonement, the emphasis really seems to be on the king, especially the king from the line of David, acting in what we might expect a high priest to act, offering sacrifices in many cases, giving a blessing to the people, even though we refer to it as the blessing of Aaron. Solomon is doing all of this, much like his father before him did, which sets a pattern that will take place in these other kings. So the writer of Kings is again harking all the way back to Exodus chapter 19, reminding us that the king of Israel is king of a kingdom of priests, and therefore the kings themselves are priests. Chronicles will make this more explicit, but we can even see it here in some of these ambiguities in 1 Kings 5 through 9, as the writer again is making it seem like Solomon is the one that is responsible. 1 Kings chapter 10 tells us of the glory of Solomon's kingdom and his continued rise to fame throughout the ancient world because of his wisdom. Even the Queen of Sheba has to come and see the glory of Solomon's kingdom and to hear his wisdom. The Queen of Sheba was from Ethiopia, from Cush, from that kingdom there, and was a very powerful entity and a very powerful kingdom in northeast Africa. Tradition on the Ethiopian side says that when the Queen of Sheba went back to her own country, she went back with more than just some insight into Solomon's kingdom. Instead, the kings and the queens that continued from her line actually traced their lineage back to Solomon, claiming that the Queen of Sheba had a little bun in the oven when she went back to Ethiopia. There's nothing in the text that suggests that, but then again, I wouldn't really put it past Solomon either. Unfortunately, Solomon's glory is the beginning of his downfall, because Solomon begins to collect those very things that he was not supposed to collect. He begins to collect money, he begins to collect horses. In fact, we're told explicitly that his horses, some 12 to 14,000 of them, are from Egypt, which is the very place that in Deuteronomy chapter 17 he was told not to collect horses from, not to go back to Egypt in order to get horses. And so here the writer of Kings is explicit in that's where these horses are coming from. Solomon makes silver as plentiful as the stones on the ground, which is great for the prosperity of Israel. But then as Solomon gets older, his heart begins to be taken away because he lives in such comfort. He's no longer dependent upon God. And his wives, which he also collects almost as much as he collects horses, begin to lead him astray. He begins to worship the other gods and goddesses of the surrounding areas. He worships Ashtoreth, also known as Astarte or Asherah. He also worships Chemosh and Molech and the other detestable gods of the area. He offers sacrifices to them. It doesn't say explicitly that he offers child sacrifices or the sacrifice of humans, which some of those gods, their worship entailed, but it does say that he built high places for them in order to please his wives. We're told that Solomon did not fully follow after the Lord his God. He did not follow him completely in his heart as he did before, suggesting that perhaps he still followed after God somewhat. That maybe this answers the question as to whether or not Solomon was still a believer. We also, though, have the indication that his heart turned away from God, which suggests that maybe he did completely turn away from worshiping the Lord as God, so that he was not still a believer. There's still great debate on that. Chronicles seems to wade in and suggest that Solomon was still a believer and that he did repent, but here in Kings we have no indication of that. We're only told about Solomon's idolatry. Because of that, we have the punishment of Solomon that begins in chapter 11 and goes in through chapter 12, and that being that God sends against Solomon several other nations. One of them is Hadad, the king of the Edomites. We're told in chapter 11 explicitly that Pharaoh so respects Hadad that Pharaoh gives Hadad one of Pharaoh's wife's sisters. This is pretty remarkable because earlier in 1 Kings chapter 3 and again in chapter 9, we're told that Pharaoh actually gave Solomon one of Pharaoh's daughters. It's remarkable because typically the daughters of Pharaoh don't leave Egypt. Even when there is a marriage alliance, that marriage alliance entails the daughter staying in Egypt. And yet we see Solomon in all of his glory actually building a palace for the daughter of Pharaoh, meaning that she at some point left Egypt and came to live with him. And now we're seeing the same thing with Hadad. Pharaoh even has shifted his allegiance from the Israelites and the love that he has for his daughter to now Hadad, king of the Edomites. Perhaps Pharaoh, playing the odds as it were, is still in allegiance with both, but at the very least he now also has an allegiance with the Edomites, which is going to create problems with Israel further down the line. Solomon has conflict with other marauding bands left over from the time of David, but most famously has a conflict with Jeroboam, and the story begins to read a little bit like the story of Saul and David, where Solomon understands that Jeroboam has been selected and anointed as the next king of Israel by a prophet, Ahijah, instead of Samuel, who anointed David, obviously since Samuel is dead. Ahijah tears a garment into 12 pieces, gives 10 of them to Jeroboam. When Solomon finds out about this, Solomon tries to kill Jeroboam, much like Saul trying to kill David. Jeroboam flees, and eventually will come back after Solomon dies. After Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam becomes the king of Israel, and Rehoboam is not anywhere near as wise as his father. He doesn't listen to his father's advisors when it comes to the time to tax the people. Instead, he listens to the young men. He so offends all the people of Israel that they rebel against him and go and leave and follow Jeroboam. Rehoboam decides to amass an army, and he gets ready to attack, and then he's told by a prophet, "Don't do this. These are your fellow Israelites, and this is from God. Be content with the two tribes that you have." From this point on, because of the sin of Solomon, there will be two nations in Israel. There will be the northern kingdom, often called Israel or Samaria, and there will be the southern kingdom known as Judah. It actually is technically Judah, Benjamin, parts of the Levites, but we still often refer to it as the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom, 2 tribes in the south, 10 in the north. This will be the pattern until after the exile, and all of it goes back to the beginning of Saul's sin. Solomon's sin. Solomon is the one who worshipped other gods, and God has punished him by sending upon Israel this great unfolding of the enemies of God who are fighting against Judah. Jeroboam becomes one of those enemies of God, sadly, as we'll see in the next few chapters. Sadly, the split in the kingdom of Israel is not just a political split, but a religious split. Jeroboam realizes the problem of having all of his people go down to Jerusalem to worship God, so instead he sets up his own temples, his own shrines in Dan and Bethel, basically making an alternative to the worship of God in Jerusalem. He uses golden calves, reminiscent of Exodus chapter 32 and the golden calf there. It's possible that Jeroboam is borrowing from the religion of the Canaanites and the god El, spelled E-L, where El is pictured as a bull or sometimes riding on a bull. There's debate as to whether or not the bull is God or if it's the throne of God, similar to the way the Ark of the Covenant is not God but is the throne of God. Several of these deities, including El, are said to ride on a bull but are also called the bull. And so it is quite difficult to know which is which. Scholars go either way. It's probably not indicating Baal or Hadad, the god of the Phoenicians, because the Phoenicians have not yet influenced Israelite religion. The Baals, the little Baals, and the little Ashtoreths are simply local deities, local gods, kind of underlings, as it were. But the main god of Hadad has not yet come into Israel. Baal worship, the worship of Hadad, will really begin in earnest when Jezebel marries King Ahab. But Jeroboam here is trying to create his own religion so that the people will follow in the northern tradition rather than in the southern tradition and not go down to Jerusalem. It's ironic then in 1 Kings 13 that a prophet from the southern kingdom goes to the northern kingdom, the reverse of what Jeroboam wanted to avoid, and goes and prophesies to the north, specifically to Jeroboam, saying that there will come a time when the worship of these golden calves will end. And indeed it will go on until that time foretold by this man of God. Josiah is foretold as the one who will come and desecrate these altars, taking the bones of those who used to offer sacrifices on the altars, and instead offering their bones as sacrifices on the altars, completely desecrating them and destroying them. But the worship at Baal, of Dan and Bethel will continue until that point, until Josiah stops it. So for the rest of the history of Israel, each of the Israelite kings will be referenced in relation to the sins of Jeroboam, and all the kings will continue them. In 1 Kings 14, we return to the stories of Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and neither one is good. Jeroboam wants to worship other gods and also get wisdom and input from other gods. Rehoboam as well is worshiping other gods. We're reminded twice that Rehoboam's mother is an Ammonite, which is a serious problem. Rehoboam is not even fully Israelite, and yet he is king over all Israel. And because he's not fully Israelite, but also part Ammonite, he apparently worships other gods. This is a major negative for Rehoboam, so that even the southern kingdom of Judah is led astray. But there is hope, because in the northern kingdom we will never get a godly king, but in the south, after Rehoboam, we do get the occasional godly king who is like David. The Book of Kings uses a Regnal Formula to describe the kings that reigned in Judah and in Israel. The word regnal simply means king, so this is a king formula, or a formula related to kings. In Judah, the kings reign in the capital city of Jerusalem. In Israel, they reign in the capital city of Tirzah, until the reign of Omri, in which the capital city is switched to Samaria, which becomes simply the catch-all term for the northern kingdom, although used interchangeably with Israel or with Ephraim. You can see the two formulas in 1 Kings chapter 15 through 16, as those chapters speed at a pretty quick pace through the various kings in the north and the south. There are, though, different formulas that are found in the north than there are in the south, suggesting that the Book of Kings has used other sources to establish the description of the various kingdoms. In the south, we're always told who the mother of the king is. Of course, there are always exceptions, just as we saw with the formula in Judges, where there is a typical motif or formula used to describe each judge. Hence here there is a typical formula used to describe each king. We're told how long the king reigned, we're told who his mother is, and we're also told of how close he was to David. Did he follow in the footsteps of David? Was he like David in holiness? Did he follow in God's footsteps and do what God told him to do, or was he a wicked king? In the north, we typically see a description not of the connection to David, but instead of the connection to Jeroboam. Did the king maintain the sin of Jeroboam? For instance, Nadab is the son of Jeroboam, and we're told that he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the ways of his father Jeroboam and committing the same sin his father had caused Israel to commit. We're told whether they are good or evil, but we're not told who the mother is. Instead, that particular part of the formula is reserved for the southern kings. Both of the north and the south are related to the question of holiness, but the formula is tied either to Jeroboam in the north and his sin, or to David in the south and his righteousness. So in that sense, the two formulas are very similar, but they diverge in terms of the person that is referenced. Again, we're told how many years that they reign, although there is some discussion over how the year is determined for the reign. Some people have suggested that the formulas worked slightly different, that being that if a king reigned in, say, December of one year, that whole year was counted as his first reign, whereas in another kingdom, if he began reigning in December, the first year would not be counted until the following December. All of this is an attempt to get the chronology of the kings to work, and in most cases it works just fine. However, there are some slight differences and some slight discrepancies within the accounts that make it a little more difficult to figure out how exactly the kings are reigning at the time that they are said to have reigned. So there are some differences between what is recorded for us and what even mathematically or consistently would work. But for the most part, the numbers are fairly accurate. There are different numbers occasionally given in various Greek editions, and sometimes those are compared between the Masoretic text and the Greek text. It's difficult to know which is the correct form per se. However, it seems as though the Masoretic text is more consistent in its dating and its dating practices, although it doesn't eliminate all of the problems. And so typically we rely upon the Masoretic text rather than the Septuagint to determine how many years a king reigned, keeping in mind that the number might be one or two off depending on how that particular king's reign is counted. Again, all of this is part of that formula and seems to have come from two separate documents. In fact, in some cases, the particular document that is used as the source document will actually be explicitly mentioned by the author of Kings. In other times it is not mentioned, but it does give the impression that there is something being written elsewhere that communicates this information. In 1 Kings 17, we are introduced to Elijah. Elijah and Elisha. Elijah obviously comes first, and then Elisha. Elijah will eventually commission Elisha to be the prophet of Israel. It's fascinating, though, because Elijah performs miracles, as does Elisha in 2 Kings. It's very fascinating that this takes place because thus far we have not really seen a prophet performing miracles. Elijah is one of the first, and Elisha is one of the last. After this point, we don't really see prophets performing miracles. But here, at this particular point in Israel's history, we do see the working of miracles, as Elijah and Elisha do fairly miraculous signs, from making axe heads float, to purifying water, to calling out bears to maul children, just crazy things that take place. One of them that takes place is in 1 Kings 18, which is the battle of Elijah against Baal. We have already been told that Elijah prayed and that there was no rain. James mentions this in James chapter 5 in the New Testament, that it doesn't rain for 3 years because Elijah prayed that it would not. Here against Baal, Elijah has that great contest where fire comes from heaven and consumes his offering, but not those of the worshippers of Baal. Instead, the worshippers of Baal are killed, but that is not really the end of the process. We continue to see Baal worship in Israel, despite Elijah cleaning house, as it were. Elijah, at the end of that contest, asks God to send rain, and indeed God does. It's a very powerful, powerful story, as Elijah is contesting with Baal and demonstrating that God is the God of heaven. And yet in 1 Kings 19, Elijah is still very much terrified of the worshippers of Baal, still very much terrified of Jezebel, and despairing as a prophet, and wants to quit. And instead he goes to Mount Horeb, where we see almost a reoccurrence of the theophany that takes place with Moses, where Elijah actually hears the mouth of God speaking in a still small whisper. Elijah is very much reenacting that whole appearance of God to Moses in chapter 36 of the book of Exodus. So here Elijah is comforted and encouraged and goes immediately and finds his replacement, who is Elisha. It's a Very interesting time again in Israel's history as the prophets are functioning in very unique ways that we don't typically think of prophets functioning, and yet they are directly contesting the miracles, supposedly, of Baal, and demonstrating that actually the God of Israel is the one who performs miracles, not Baal. So this is part of why these miracles are so important. There's a direct contest between gods that is taking place. And Elijah is demonstrating that he is a true prophet as opposed to the prophets of Baal. This is part of that contest, that fight that's going on between God and Baal, a fight that eventually God will win, and a fight that here obviously God should win, but because of the influence of the king and queen who follow after Baal, the people as well are fickle and follow after Baal, continuing to trust in him rather than in God, even despite the contest in chapter 18. Even though they've seen the fire fall from heaven and consume the sacrifice of the Lord, so many of the people are still led astray to follow after Baal. 1 Kings chapter 19 and 20 introduces us to King Ahab. Ahab is one of the central figures of 1 Kings. It's fascinating when you think about it that here we have a report of all of these kings within Israel in both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and yet there are more chapters on Elijah, Elisha, and Ahab than anyone else in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, and Elijah and Elisha aren't even kings. They are prophets, which again suggests that perhaps our name for these books is not necessarily the most accurate name. Ahab is nowhere near as politically significant within the ancient Near East as his father Omri. Omri is the one who is recognized by most of the other kings at this time as being so powerful and so glorious. And yet, the Bible simply skips over Omri, barely mentioning anything he accomplished, other than that he moved the capital from Tirzah to Samaria, which is what the name of the northern kingdom will most often be referred to from this point on, Samaria. Ahab, though, is the focus of 1 Kings 20 and following, all the way up through the end of 1 Kings, where he will die. In 1 Kings chapter 20, Ahab disobeys God in a way that sounds very much like Saul. Ahab did the letter of the law, but completely missed the spirit of the law. He attacks Ben-Hadad and completely destroys Ben-Hadad's armies, and yet lets Ben-Hadad go. And a prophet comes along and tells Ahab that because he has let him go, God is going to require a life from Ahab. And eventually that's what will happen. Ahab's family will be wiped out. 1 Kings 21 is the very famous story of Naboth's vineyard. What's often overlooked, though, is at the end of the chapter, after being confronted, Ahab actually repents. And in his repentance, God says, I will actually bring all the destruction upon your house after you have died, so you will not have to see any of it, which is very merciful. Again, a reminder that anybody who repents, even someone as wicked as King Ahab, can indeed find the forgiveness of God. 1 Kings 22 is a recount of the battle that Ahab and King Jehoshaphat of Judah are going to fight together. It's a fascinating story because of the lying prophets who claim, at least Micah claims, that the lying spirit has come from God, and that the whole point of these lying spirits is to put Ahab to death, which is exactly what happens. Ahab is killed by what seems like a random arrow. It's not so random because God was sovereignly in control of all of it. And yet we're left with, how can these prophets be lying to Ahab if they're from God, if they have these spirits from God? And I think the answer is that God does not view the truth the way that we tend to define it, in terms of, we often think of it as very black and white, which it is. It's either true or it's not true, and yet God is willing to use deceit, if you want to call it that, from people who should not otherwise expect the truth. There's no reason that Ahab should expect the truth from a group of false prophets. So, of course, God is going to allow false prophets to speak false words. And it shouldn't really surprise us then that God actually uses the deceit and the dishonesty of these prophets against Ahab. This makes perfect sense. So we shouldn't be as uncomfortable with the lying prophets as often we are. As soon as we see the word lying, all sorts of warning bells go off in our head and we think this must be wrong. But when we understand that God does not give truth to people who don't deserve or don't expect the truth, we begin to see it in a little bit better light. That God is actually giving Ahab exactly what Ahab should expect. He should expect falsity from false prophets. In the end, Micah is put in prison for prophesying and telling Ahab the truth, and again, demonstrating that Ahab had no right to expect the truth because he hates it. He even says, Micah always prophesies against me. Well, yeah, because you're not really having a prophet to tell you what God says. You're having a prophet that just tells you what you want to hear. So, of course, God's going to send a lying spirit and do exactly what it is that you're expecting and what it is that you want. Micah, we're never told, gets out of prison, but Ahab does indeed die in battle, bringing to an end a very odd chapter of Israel's history. Again, the conflict between Ahab, Elijah, and Elisha taking up several chapters here in the book, but it does draw this to a close. Unfortunately, it doesn't draw it necessarily to a positive close, as the northern kingdom's going to continue to be wicked, but at least we get a little bit of a reprieve. 2 Kings chapter 1 transitions us into the book of 2 Kings. Again, remembering that the books are divided based on their length in the scrolls, not so much on the content of the book. That doesn't mean that we've randomly decided to divide them in any particular place, but that we have specific reasons for doing so. The book of 1 Kings ends with the death of Ahab, whereas 2 Kings starts with the reign of Ahab's son. Although we see here that Elijah is being as contested in chapter 1 of 2 Kings as he was by Ahab at the end of 1 Kings. We see a fascinating story of numerous men being roasted to death as they try to get Elijah to come down. Finally, one of them is smart enough to figure out that rather than telling Elijah what he should do, he should beseech Elijah to come down and spare his life, which Elijah does, and probably would have done had any of them been willing to ask. Elijah is reminding not only the men who come to call him down, but also the king of Israel that the prophets are not subject to the kings, but the other way around. The kings are subject to the word of the Lord, which comes by the prophets. This goes all the way back to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18, where we're reminded in chapter 17 that there are kings, but where we're reminded in chapter 18 that there are also priests and prophets. Those prophets are the ones by whom the word of the Lord comes. So we have here a demonstration of that very fact that Elijah says, I'm a prophet, I don't have to listen to you. The prophet certainly respects the king, but not when the king is demanding something that he has no right to demand. Elijah, in a sense, is putting the king in his place, as it were, unfortunately at the expense of these other men, but those other men certainly have the same thought as the king, of we just tell Elijah what the king says and Elijah has to obey. And instead Elijah says, nope, not so fast. It's the other way around. When I tell you what the word of God says, you have to obey. Unfortunately for Ahaziah, the word of the Lord here is you're going to die, which is exactly what happens. So the emphasis in this first chapter is on Elijah's authority and the power of God's word, all of which then is conferred to Elisha in chapter 2. Elisha has been following Elijah for very, very many chapters here, but now we see the official commissioning as Elijah's power goes over to Elisha, and as we see Elijah being taken up into heaven by the flaming chariots of God. Elisha now will perform miracles and will carry on the work of Elijah with a double measure of his spirit, as Elisha asked. Fortunately, Elisha is not going to continue as a prophet for all of 2 Kings, which is great because then we can stop emphasizing Elijah or Elisha and just simply refer to the prophet. But Elisha has several more famous instances and miracles that we will cover as we continue to look at 2 Kings in the next lecture. Well, that brings us to the end of 1 Kings and this 7th lecture. Next time we'll be looking at 2 Kings.